I do want to let you know that we are going to be recording this, and it is going to be posted on our website and shared after the program. So if you would like to have your cameras off so that you are not recorded as well, you may do that. And during the Q&A, we may ask, you don't have to turn your cameras on if you don't want to, but you can do that if you'd like. And it sounds like everybody's muted, but if you please could stay muted during the speaking part. And again, we'll have some time for Q&A after. We did have a lot of people register for this, which is very exciting. So I am going to do my formal introduction for the recording. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Geraldine Ducati. I am the Director of Education at the Rhode Island Historical Society. And welcome to Evaluating Sources when Researching Indigenous People and History. So thank you for taking the time to be here today or to watch the recording. This is the final program in a series my colleagues of fellow New England National History Day coordinators have put together for our teachers and school librarians. I want to especially thank Alyssa Tardif and Kate Melchior of the Massachusetts Historical Society and Massachusetts History Day, who helped coordinate this session and serve as the session sponsor. So I noticed we have folks from local libraries and other history and heritage organizations who found out about this program and registered. So I'm happy to see that this topic has interest outside of our National History Day and even our New England realm, and hope the recording will continue to be useful for professionals and students alike when thinking about including Indigenous voice in research and projects. So for those unfamiliar with History Day, it is a national organization of which there are state coordinators who run regional and state history competitions for middle and high school students. Winners of the state competition compete at a national competition in College Park, Maryland. So students work as individuals or in groups to conduct original research on historical topics of interest and showcase their work through exhibits, performances, websites, documentaries, and papers. So one of the judging criteria has to do with including multiple perspectives. So we have found that many students oftentimes fail to include Indigenous perspectives in their projects when they're covering such topics. So likely due to not knowing where to find that. So that brought us to invite Leah Hopkins to speak today. And while we may not solve the issue in a short program, I believe what Leah has prepared for us will help give students direction. For those of you who have never heard of History Day, we always look for judges. So whatever state you're in, look for your state historical History Day coordinator and sign up to be a judge. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Leah. So Leah Hopkins is a mother, educator, culture bearer, subsistence practitioner, and museum professional, and is an enrolled member of the Narragansett Indian Tribe of Rhode Island. Leah works to develop and implement programs, curricula, and digital content for Indigenous and non-Indigenous audiences about Native history, culture, values, lifeways, and practices. She also works to ensure cultural continuity in the area's Indigenous peoples through programs, workshops, and advocacy. She is a professional speaker, consultant, traditional dancer, and singer grounded in Narragansett land and sea-based practices. Leah works collaboratively with Indigenous and tribal communities, museums, and other institutions to ensure best practices in programming and education initiatives that promote the visibility and ensure the perspectives of Indigenous populations in New England. Leah holds a BA in Anthropology from the University of Rhode Island and has a background in museum and tribal education that spans over 10 years, working at both the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, the Wampanoag Tribe of Gay Head, Aquina, and with other regional institutions, organizations, and tribal communities. Leah is currently the Community Engagement Specialist at the Haffenreffer Museum of Anthropology at Brown University. In her personal time, Leah enjoys playing with her son and taking him out on the land and the water to teach him about the traditional subsistence lifestyle and ensure that the next generation maintains cultural continuity. So thank you. I will now turn the program over to Leah.
Kapatash, thank you very much, Geraldine. Thank you very much to Mass Historical for inviting me to present today for National History Day. So I'll start with my traditional protocol greeting. Cha winikisak, na tasawisliawana ni na Narragansett, na Thomas Akudnesset, na Tai North Providence at. And what I just told you was, hello, my name is Leah. I'm a citizen of the Narragansett Indian tribe right here in Rhode Island. I grew up in what is called North Kingstown today, North Kingstown, Rhode Island, and I now live with my family in the area of what's now North Providence. And I am very, very happy and excited to be here. Today, we are evaluating and exploring best practices for teaching and learning about Native people through looking closely at evaluating sources on Native folks. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's start. Oops. Hang on one second. All right, there we go. Okay, so everyone should be able to share my screen. Today, I will highlight an online source that I created and provide information on how to critically look at on sources on Indigenous topics. So there are just a few things before we get started. Today, we ask all of our participants to be fully present and listen deeply and respond thoughtfully. Please respect the opinion of others and use appropriate language. Be patient with technology and those responsible for administering it. If you can, turn on your video to increase opportunities for human connection, especially in breakout rooms. And then please mute your audio when you're not speaking. And we'll save questions for the end of the session. And most importantly, enjoy yourself and have a good time. So I like to begin a lot of my talks and my programs with a land acknowledgement. Today, I'm coming to you from my traditional homeland of the Narragansett people. And I want to acknowledge my ancestors and the land and the beings that are here in creation. I acknowledge that I live and work and travel in the confluence of the areas shared by Narragansett, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag people, and I honor our shared histories and presence and rightful place upon the land and sea. So everywhere that I go, I consider the ancestors of that place, the beings in creation, the land, and the Indigenous people that may be residing there today. And I'd like you to take a moment to think about where you are. Who are the ancestors of that place? What beings are there in creation? The lands and the waterways, and what Indigenous people are living in your community? And how can you be a good neighbor? So I'd like to begin with working with folks and digging deep into your memory, back into the archives. And I would like to ask the question, what is your earliest memory of learning about Indigenous people? So before we begin, I just want to open up this icebreaker activity, and Geraldine is going to help me by putting everyone into a couple of breakout rooms. And as you think about this, and when you go into your breakout room and discuss it, I would like you to pull out any themes, maybe what you're struck by, and similarities or differences in your experiences amongst one another. So we'll go into people are starting to trickle back in. We'll give everybody another couple of seconds. All right, so I'm sorry, we only had about 5 minutes to discuss, but does anyone want to share out either in the chat or through the raise hand feature, which is in your control panel down below. It's in reactions. Any of the themes or what in particular they were struck by, or similarities or differences from their discussion on their earliest memories. Great, these are all really interesting themes and things that I have seen over the course of my work. Things have not changed. People have been going to Plymouth Plantation. There's a lack of Indigenous voice. Emphasis on more of a craft project than a cultural or history lesson. Okay, some people had experience with finding artifacts, stereotypes. That term has come up a couple of times. The curriculum is the same as it was 50 years ago, the grouping of Indigenous people together. Not a consistent part of the curriculum and treated as an aside. So these were, oh, and field trips too. So these were all different considerations that I had when putting together this presentation. And I have met people from all across the country who have had shared similar memories with me and similar concerns. And these are some of the things that I even grew up with in some of my curriculum, whether in elementary school or even college. And so the narrative is changing and shifting ever so slowly. I would say in the past couple of years, we are seeing a more progressive move towards a more inclusive education about Indigenous people, but still we have leagues to catch up on. And so we'll be addressing some of those things today with culturally responsive teaching and evaluation. So let's jump into this. Culturally responsive teaching is a whole subject all on its own. And what I'm presenting today is a very specific subset of culturally responsive teaching that I have many years of personal and professional experience with. The tenets that are highlighted here are recognized by many of my Indigenous colleagues in the field of K-12 education and museum education. And there are also overlaps with university and informal teaching. Today, we will be discussing recognizing stereotyping, appropriation, and bias in sources, historicization versus contemporization, educating yourself, using Indigenous created resources, and meeting the needs of your students. You will notice that stereotyping, appropriation, and bias are highlighted in red and the rest are green. Stereotyping, bias, and appropriation are very common occurrences in the K-12 classroom, both here in New England and nationally when it comes to Indigenous topics. And today, we are going to identify these common occurrences, and we are going to use the tenets in green to combat these occurrences and practice culturally responsive teaching and critical evaluation as a method of harm reduction towards Indigenous communities. As we identify stereotyping, appropriation, and bias, I acknowledge that many folks in this room may be hearing about these practices for the first time, or maybe they have a colleague that incorporates them into their classrooms or a student in their class that has used inappropriate resources. Maybe you have incorporated them into your teaching and research. But I think we have all come here today to learn about positive and respectful strategies for teaching and learning about the subject matter. My goal is to not alienate anyone from unintentionally participating in the perpetuation of harmful stereotypes, bias, or appropriation. But it's to help those here to identify and create a holistic pathway forward towards sensitive, accurate, and respectful representation of Indigenous peoples. The field is constantly changing, and the field is now more inclusive of Indigenous voice. What was acceptable 10 years ago has changed. What was acceptable 50 years ago has most certainly changed. and that's okay. These have changed for the better. I'm here today to bring everyone up to speed. If you're employing these methods and practices now, I commend you for being here today, and together we can all participate in improving the field. So, recognizing stereotypes. Let's discuss. There have been many instances Indigenous educators and students have gone into classrooms and have been met with stereotypical tropes in resources. Most commonly, these manifest as books telling us to make headdresses or teepee crafts, or gestures that are reminiscent of Hollywood Westerns, where all Indigenous people are homogenized and oversimplified. Or these resources are riddled with language talking about brave, stoic, and warlike Indians, in quotes. These are, number one, incorrect and not representative of any tribal nation practices, and more importantly, two, they're harmful to Native students when they see themselves represented as a caricature. It is best to steer clear from any of these resources. Ultimately, like any other group, we want to present Indigenous people with dignity and respect and see ourselves accurately represented in books and media. Recognizing appropriation. Many times, headdresses, war paint, and gestures are considered appropriation. For the purposes of today, I'm acknowledging that, but also taking it a step further. Many people here today may say, the resources I'm reading are not stereotypical, but I want you to ask yourself, are they appropriative? Are these resources created by an Indigenous person? If not, are they promoting the use of Indigenous knowledge and cultural or spiritual practices without permissions and context from the tribal nation they originate from? Appropriation can look like using Indigenous symbology, buying or promoting Native-inspired materials, or using inappropriate materials to make crafts. Let's take example for this book here, The Education of Little Tree. It was long read and celebrated by many 4th through 6th grade classrooms. It was a book that I was required to read for a 5th grade class. It is a memoir-style novel written by Asa Earl Carter under the pseudonym Forrest Carter and was first published in 1976. It recounts the author's youth and his time with his Cherokee grandparents. The book was celebrated and received wide recognition by Oprah Winfrey's book club and achieved a top spot on the New York Times bestseller list for its sentiments on environmentalism and Indigenous mysticism. The author of the book, Asa Earl Carter, was later outed as making these false claims of being from the Cherokee Nation, and he was actually a member of the Ku Klux Klan. This book is a perfect example of appropriation as an author attempts to adorn himself through his writing with a Cherokee identity. Avoiding bias is probably the most challenging of critical evaluation of resources on Indigenous people. Why? Because the intentions of the author are not always clear or known. Watch out for disparaging language, such as, quote, warlike, vicious, barbarous, wild, brave, primitive, simple, or most notably, savage. And be careful to see how the author compares Indigenous cultures and practices against European practices. Where's the author placing praise? On the Indigenous cultures or on the European or Western cultures? And a lot of these terms and a lot of the ethnocentrism that you may find would be in more historical accounts, but they do exist in contemporary writings as well. When looking at resources, it is important to ask the following questions. Who is the author? Are they Indigenous? What is their relationship to Indigenous people? Do they work with Indigenous people? Who is the audience they are addressing? If it's a historical work, take it a step further and ask these questions. What country, colony, religious sect, or monarchy are they representing? Are they representing the interests of any of those groups? What is the position of power at the time? Who is attempting to run the show? What is their purpose for writing about Indigenous people? Are they trying to establish a colony, government, capitalist venture, etc.? Is this an act of religious conversion? What is the purpose of conversion in this situation? And most notably, this is within anthropological writings, is the author trying to, quote, save information from dying out? And if it is an anthropological work, are they compensating their informants? So now that we have identified stereotyping, appropriation, and bias, let's talk about ways to combat this. With historicization and contemporarization, it's very easy with the curriculum standards that we have on a state level to fall into the trap of historicization. For instance, November is the most common time of the year to teach about Native people, not because it's Native American Heritage Month, but because it's the time when we teach about Thanksgiving, especially here in New England. It is the gateway into talking about the colonial history of America, but it's important that Indigenous history is taught as a part of deep time. Here in New England, Indigenous presence goes back more than 15,000 years. So why aren't we teaching about Indigenous people all year long? Why aren't we reading about Indigenous people all year long? One of the biggest challenges as an Indigenous educator is to have students understand that Indigenous people still exist. Working in the museum field, I've had students be shocked that they are speaking to a living, breathing Native person and that we are not extinct like the dinosaurs. Many history texts, novels, and other sources have placed Indigenous people as being in the past. They do this through cherry picking Indigenous topics that fit only into certain time periods and rarely mention modern Indigenous communities. A way we can combat this is to be careful that we are using resources with active language, not passive language. If you want to learn about, say, a historical event like Metacom's War, commonly known as King Philip's War in the area, let's also talk about modern day Wampanoag communities. If you are looking to learn about what traditions were practiced 400 years ago, such as pottery or basketry, for example, also bring in information about modern day Indigenous potters or basket makers from that or related nations. If we are only discussing Indigenous people in the context of Thanksgiving or the founding of America as part of the October-November curricula, how can we continue to incorporate Indigenous people and contributions into our curricula and studies year-round? One method is to be inclusive of contemporary populations and people. Look to different roles or people throughout history. In each century, like Paul Cuff in the 19th, Jim Thorpe in the 20th century, Deb Helen in the 21st century. You can find more information about contemporary Indigenous people from this newly released book that I have here by Dr. Adrienne Keene from the Cherokee Nation. She is faculty here at Brown University. And look for biographies written about Indigenous people from sources who have active relationships with the communities that the source is from. educating yourself. This tenet is super important, and I received a couple of questions about it and some of the other programs that I have given. How do I know what resources are good? Let's take a step back and look critically. Begin by reading about the author. Read about their positionality. Let's look at their past publications. What is their agenda? What biases do they have? Who is their source material? Similar questions to what we were asking before. Is this a person from the nation or community they are writing about? Or are they going to other specialists who are not from any of those nations they are writing about? Are they simplifying a story? Are they embellishing a story or event? There are hundreds of resources available about the first Thanksgiving. But if you go back to the primary documents, it was a fleeting moment that didn't even get more than a paragraph in William Bradford's 1621 account of Plymouth Plantation. This is an embellished story. Also, you should avoid historical fiction. This can confuse students as to what is a historical event and what is fictionalized. And look to tribally owned museums, libraries, or cultural departments of the tribes that you intend to teach about. They are the authority. Build relationships with local Indigenous educators. And for anyone who's wishing to do this, please contact me, as I have curated a list of K through 12 educators who regularly go into schools for programming. Oh, and I do want to mention, when looking at non-Indigenous resources, it's also best practice to use resources where the author has consulted with tribes or respected culture bearers and community members. This book here, for example, Memory Lands, is written by non-native author Christine DeLucia, and she works with Indigenous community members in New England when sourcing her materials on historical Indigenous colonial relations. When looking for resources, look for authors who have committed themselves to the communities they are representing. Then you know that there is accountability. The best way to approach all of these tactics and techniques is to use native created resources in your work, your classroom, and your library. Indigenous people are the experts on ourselves. Look to tribes first. Most tribal nations have regularly updated websites and have historical and cultural information on them. Look to Indigenous authors and illustrators. If you're a teacher, feature them in your classroom. They are going to have a unique perspective that is not available in non-Indigenous resources. When selecting resources, it is best practice to first look at resources that are from the specific tribal communities that you're studying. Look for authors from that nation. Look for illustrators from that nation. They will help you to see how the people want to be represented themselves. They will be able to give you a first-person perspective on their own subject matter. For example, if I wanted to study Muskogee Creek people, which I know very little about, and I want to study the people and the history, I would, number one, first look at the Muskogee Creek website and see what information is there. Then I would look for a Muskogee Creek author. I would look for videos or audio recordings posted by the Muskogee Creek Nation or from their museum and cultural center. So after that process, after I've gone through all of those and I've gleaned enough information, then I would start either my writing, my report, my presentation, if I'm a student. If there were not many resources, and I personally don't know because I have not studied Muskogee Creek people, then I would start by looking at other Indigenous authors who have written about Muskogee Creek people. And I'll get into that a little bit about looking at other Indigenous authors. And then third, I would then look to non-Native authors who have read, or excuse me, who have worked directly with Muskogee Creek people. So I have the process of first going to the tribe themselves and then going to the authors from that tribe and researchers, and then going to other Indigenous people who have worked with the tribe, and then finally to non-Indigenous resources. You can use sources such as oyate.org or birchbarkbooks.com as Native specialists vet their content. Oyate curates age-appropriate resources by Native authors and illustrators and provides reviews by Indigenous specialists. They also have an online shop. Birchbark Books is a bookstore in Minnesota that ships countrywide, and their staff has extensive experience in selecting appropriate books to fulfill academic standards pertaining to Indigenous American history, and they have authors for all grade levels. They also have a selection of non-Indigenous titles that are up to the current standards of Indigenous educators and tribal nations. When looking at non-Indigenous resources, it is also best practice to use resources where the author has consulted or has worked with respected culture bearers, as I said before. Sometimes Indigenous authors choose to focus on history or topics from other tribal nations. It's imperative to look to see if they're actively working with source community members as well. It's important to do your due diligence. This information is often found in the acknowledgements and forward sections of the book. As an example, I have here a book by Chris Newell, If You Lived During the Plymouth Thanksgiving. Chris is a Passamaquoddy tribal nation citizen actively working with culture bearer and educator Linda Coombs from the Aquinnah Wampanoag Nation to write this book aimed at grades 3 through 5. Another example would be Ojibwe author Jean O'Brien. She has a number of research books and papers written about Indigenous people here in Southern New England and has actively built relationships and collaborated with folks from the communities that she's writing about. This creates accountability, which is very important. There are many authors who will go out and write about Indigenous history, or say, for example, Narragansett history or Narragansett culture. But if they're not actively working with the Narragansett community and the Narragansett Nation, they do not have any accountability. And it's not a reciprocal relationship. There are many resources that are created, there are many resources available online for Indigenous created curricula for K through 12. Look at reputable sources such as individual tribes and the National Museum of the American Indian and Indigenous education nonprofits, such as Illuminatives, for out-of-the-box curricula. If you're a teacher planning a field trip for your students, I recommend that you first explore options for tribally owned or Indigenous operated museums and cultural centers. They prioritize the content that best represents their own people. If visiting non-Indigenous museums, it is best to ask whether their content accurately reflects the voices of contemporary Indigenous people. Look for Indigenous curated exhibitions, many of which are online and are available to your students. There are a number of Indigenous educators and different resources who are available and willing to come to your classroom or library. It is important to consider their time and preparation that they put into their programming and offering a stipend is necessary, and oftentimes many parent-teacher organizations are available and willing to assist. Again, if you would like to be connected to Indigenous educators or specialists, please feel free to reach out to me. Now, meeting the needs of your Native students, but also your classmates, if you are a student yourself. This is a crucial topic in culturally responsive teaching. It is important for us all to remember that there may be students in your classroom or your classroom families or in your school community that are Indigenous. These students may not necessarily present as what many people would identify as Native, or they may not choose to openly identify themselves to you or their class. But that is why it is so important to use the utmost care in discussing and teaching about Native people and topics. Representation matters. When students see themselves properly reflected in the curriculum and resources, they are more likely to engage with it. They may actively withdraw from participating if they are made to feel uncomfortable through stereotypes, appropriation, bias, and poor representation. But this is a fine line to walk. We want our students to feel positive about what is being taught. But if we ourselves haven't been given the appropriate tools, it may be tempting to rely on our students or their families for resources and information. Much of what's being taught today, as we identified earlier, was taught 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or more. The field of Native and Indigenous studies has increased and expanded, but not much of it has changed in terms of curriculum development. You may have Indigenous parents who reach out to you with their concerns about how Indigenous content was treated as part of their curriculum as a children, or how their content was treated in a library. Use this as an opportunity to see if they're interested in conversations, but it is also important to take a step back and avoid tokenization of their Native students that can make them feel like ambassadors for their family, their nation, or all Indigenous people. And finally, with this in mind, let's advocate for their autonomy. If they play a larger role in participating in your content, that's great, that's exciting, but they may also want to hang back too, and that's completely okay. So my background is in tribal communities and museums. For so long, our stories have been told for us and not by us in museums, in research, in books, in curriculum, in media. And I have been an advocate for pushing that voice to speak for itself. I am here to help elevate it to a new level in our education programs and in the future with regards to permanent exhibitions at regional museums and in school districts. When creating programs and resources, I always ask, how does this program eliminate social disparities in Indigenous communities? How can we center around Indigenous voice and knowledge? Well, this is done by providing opportunities and assistance to have the Indigenous voice speak for itself. This is done by understanding and trusting that Indigenous people have a working knowledge of their own history and culture and are completely capable of caring for their own objects of cultural patrimony and knowledge. And by understanding that representation matters. Native people have often been portrayed as being from the past or being just craftspeople and not fine artists. And so I'm here to help change the narrative. I also want to assist in the taking back of the control of knowledge and subjectivity through education and existing knowledges. Historically, public representation of Indigenous people has placed people in the past, has undertones of primitivism and lack of knowledge. And the curricula, the framework, the programming, the exhibit design, the arrangement, all has a total lack of representation, whether it's in schools, whether it's in museums, whether it's in media. And we are not upheld as experts of our own history and people. It's imperative that we have inclusion of Indigenous people at every step of the way. In the planning, development, grant writing, designing, curating, curricula development, execution, and programming, it should all have prominent Indigenous voice. And we need to be accountable to our stakeholders, the communities that we engage with, that we are representing. And so it's so important, and I know this is a little bit out of the realm of talking about evaluating resources, but if we all start to change how Indigenous people are included in all of these aspects, this is also going to help change the field of resources as well. It's going to help change the field of curriculum development. It's going to change on the state level with curriculum development. It can change on the national level. So with all of these things in mind, I created a virtual module called This Land is Home. Out of the COVID-19 pandemic, I worked with my manager of museum education and programs at the Haffenreffer Museum of Anthropology at Brown University, Leah Bergen. And I had to think tank away, or we had to think tank away to engage in classrooms when we couldn't be in the classrooms as we had traditionally had with our outreach programs. We wanted to create something that could be used both in classrooms and through virtual learning. When I created this, the guidelines were unclear if schools were going to stay in virtual or move back to in-person. In the development process, we looked at the curriculum standards for Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, the Common Core, social justice standards, among others, to ensure the content would be in compliance with all of these standards. And out of it, we developed specific enduring understandings. I didn't want to only ever put Native people in relevance and conversation with the colonial era. American history begins with Indigenous history, and it continues to endure and grow beyond the colonial experience. If nothing else, I wanted to ensure that students walked away with these understandings. In my field of Indigenous education, we recognize that if the world understands accurate representation of Indigenous people, histories, and cultures, then it will foster respect for Indigenous people and thus increasing the quality of life and will assist in beginning to close the gap in racial disparities. So if my students walked away with nothing except these things, I had a good day. Native people still exist today, and we thrive locally and globally, and we reflect cultural continuity, and we engage with our past history, and we need to be celebrated. And so the enduring understandings that you see here are what are my 4 main points for creating this module. And so it went into every aspect of creating the content for it. So This Land is Home is a seasonally based educational tool that exclusively uses the Native voice and perspective to teach about Native people and our relationships to our homelands, the seasons, the gifts of the land and waters as well. As we move through the module, the visitor will be able to answer, what does it mean to be Indigenous? What does it mean to belong to a tribe? What is culture and why is culture important? How do objects help us learn about culture? How are contemporary Native people similar to you, and how are they different? And how do humans shape the environment? How does the environment shape humans? And how does the cycle of the seasons affect human activities, both past and present? Students will learn the definitions of Indigenous, Native, tribe, territory, as well as the names and territories of many New England Native communities. They will learn the definition of culture and importance of objects is one way to learn about cultures. And they will learn how different cultural practices, they will learn different cultural practices directly from a first person Native perspective. And this is done through videos of Native people speaking about their traditions as contemporary people. And they will learn how the seasonal round shapes traditional and contemporary Indigenous lifeways in New England, and how some Native people view their relationships with nature. Students will actively practice new vocabulary in English and Algonquian. They will analyze and interpret objects and material culture, including making observations. They will describe the activities of Native New England people, both historically and contemporarily in each season. And via writing and drawing activities, they will reflect upon their own relationship with nature. They will identify similarities and differences between their own cultural seasonal activities and those of historical and contemporary Native people. You can see here a snippet from the autumn season. I pulled this section as I think it's the most visually appealing. I just love the fall colors. But it is a way to teach about traditional and contemporary lifeways of Native people. We introduce Native voice through the text, also using a series of videos curated through YouTube that show modern Indigenous people speaking on the traditions that are still practiced today, such as hunting deer or making a moose call. These are then put in conversation with Indigenous belongings that the Haffenreffer stewards in our collection, such as this moose call right here. The diagrams help the students to understand the relationship between the raw materials, such as the deer, and the significance of what the animal may mean in Native society. Educators can request worksheets that were created with grades 3 through 5 in mind, though they have been requested by K through college, including homeschool families. These worksheets can be used digitally, or they are available for printing, and you can request them right through our education department. Also, there's an educator's guide that we will link in the chat, and it's also provided right on the Haffenreffer's website. And we created this as a companion piece on how to teach with this module, including the curricula standards that we followed. So I know that this here is aimed at grades 3 through 5, but this is a great example of culturally responsive teaching. It is Indigenous created, and it's created where I'm a Narragansett person. I am talking about Narragansett people here with the text, but I'm also providing you with direct voices of people who are talking about their own traditions. And so this resource does not have stereotypes in it. It does not have appropriation in it. And so we wanted to create an out-of-the-box resource, and that's where this came from. And it's age appropriate. I've had college students, I've had adults engage with this material, and oftentimes this is the first time they are engaging with such material from that Native perspective. So with that, I am going to say Katapatanamu. Thank you all very much. I have 2 emails here that you can reach me through. And now I'm going to open it for questions. I do see that the chat is lighting up a little bit here. So if people have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature.
Thank you so much, Leah. This has been incredible. And I just want to remind folks, we are recording this to post online. If you would like to use to turn your camera on and ask a live question, but you prefer not to have your face online, please just feel free to turn your camera off.
Just looking through some of the questions in the chat, someone had asked, was More Than Moccasins a good book? I had that book up on there to show an example of what is not an appropriate resource. More Than Moccasins is written by a non-Indigenous person. It is filled with many stereotypical activities, such as making teepee crafts or headdress crafts. So I do not recommend that as a resource. That was more of a don't do this book, as was The Education of Little Tree.
Leah, I wanted to ask, you say you have a list of educators that visit classrooms. Is that for the New England region only, or
yes,
what? Yeah, okay.
That is only for the New England region because that is the circles that I travel in. If you are from another part of the States or maybe even Canada, I would recommend going directly to your local federal or state recognized tribe and start looking to see what they have. Even calling the office and say, hey, do you have anyone either in your office or do you recommend anyone from your tribal community who would be willing to come and speak to my class? Oh, somebody missed the last sentence of enduring understandings. I think that was, I did talk about, let's see. Let me go back to the slide here. Resume share. Okay. So yes, and thank you very much, Megan, for putting it in the chat. We can learn about Native people directly from Native people and the objects that they make and use. So that was a key goal in mind. How can I create something that I can't, because of COVID-19, I, as a Native educator, cannot come into the classroom. I can't refer somebody to the classroom right now because classrooms are not taking on visitors. So how can I connect the students to that voice? And that was through these YouTube videos. So I can leave that slide up. Are there any questions? Feel free to, if you have any other questions that maybe you want to talk to me about offline, feel free to send an email to either address. And I can put my address here, and I will also put them in the chat.
We will also send a follow-up email with the link to the recording once the recording's ready and posted, with links to all the links that Leah shared and also her email addresses. Looks like everyone's saying thank you. I don't know if there's any more questions.
I just want to say Katabatanamu, thank you all for coming. I hope we were all able to learn a little bit more together and that this was helpful for your classroom and teaching.
I also wanted to thank everyone for coming, and thank you so much, Leah, for this. This was excellent.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Leah, and not only for this wonderful presentation, but the fact that this becomes a resource that I can share with people that I work with for ages to come. This is wonderful.
Oh, we got a thank you from Oregon. All right, thank you, everyone.